As Russia's war in Ukraine enters its second year with no end in sight and NATO countries continue to pledge more heavy weapons, what are the prospects for negotiated settlement and peace? Can either side prevail militarily as the war rages on? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The war in Ukraine has entered its second year, with each side vowing to defeat the other amid a growing risk of escalation and the threat of a widening conflict. Despite recent pledges by the United States and other Western countries to provide Kiev with main battle tanks and possibly other heavy weaponry, including fighter jets, it is still unclear whether the promised American Abrams and German Leopard tanks will be deployed in the numbers and timeframes hoped for by Ukraine. Only 2 countries have pledged to send the latest version of the Leopard 2 tanks. Germany will send 14 and Portugal 3. Poland has assembled 30 older versions of the Leopard tanks expected to be delivered to Ukraine at the end of April. The United States has pledged to send 31 of its Abrams tanks.
This is an important moment. I look forward to the discussion and the next steps we can take together and to keep our alliance strong and to further deter aggression. Because what literally is at stake is not just Ukraine, it's freedom. The idea that over 100,000 forces would invade another country after war, since World War II, nothing like that has happened. Things have changed radically. We have to make sure we change them back.
We don't know when the war will end, but when it does, we need to ensure that history does not repeat itself. We have seen the Russian pattern of aggression over many years. Georgia in 2008, Crimea and Donbass in 2014, and then the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine last year. We cannot allow Russia to continue to chip away at European security. We must break the cycle of Russian aggression.
But how will the timing of the delivery of weapons pledged by Western allies affect the Ukrainian army's ability to fight off a new Russian offensive? And with Ukrainian President Zelensky ruling out any territorial compromises or negotiations with Russian President Putin, can there be peace anytime soon? Joining me now to discuss the balance of power on the battlefield and prospects for a negotiated solution is former NATO Supreme Commander George Jolwin. General Jolwin, you held one of the most senior positions within NATO and conducted many operations in the Balkans back in the 1990s. When you look at the way this war is going, Zelensky says the anticipated spring offensive has begun. Can this conflict be settled militarily? Can there be a military outcome to this?
I don't think so. I think it's going to take much more than that to include the political side, the economic side, and all of that is going to factor into the outcome. But what the military can do, what the Ukrainians can do, is to put up the sort of fight they're putting up, and it's going to take support from the United States, from NATO, to allow it to do what it needs to do militarily.
Do you concur with the top U.S. general, Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who reportedly said in internal discussions that a negotiated settlement is the best way to bring this war to an end and should be pursued? Do you agree with him? And do you believe the Biden administration has been wrong-headed?
Well, if it can work, but the other thing, what if it doesn't work? Then what do you do?
But should it be tried? Should it be pursued?
I really think you have to figure out when to do that. And I think when Ukraine blunted the attack initially, and were stunned by the opposition, by the Ukrainians, and the support from NATO, I thought that would be a time that we should have really searched for some negotiations. But now it's very difficult. But I would always support negotiations. But the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, fighting for their land, fighting for their country. And so I don't think it's going to be a negotiated settlement. I think it's going to be settled on the battlefield.
But can it end any other way but around the table in a negotiated settlement?
But how do you bring them to the table? You see, how do you, and there comes a point, even for Russia, big Russia with hundreds of thousands of troops, they have suffered several defeats now. They have suffered defeat on the battlefield. They've suffered defeat economically, and politically, they're a pariah in Europe and the world. And so, all of that plays into if it's going to be a negotiated settlement. But you have to be able to do the sorts of things the Ukrainians are doing on the ground.
Zelensky says he wants, quote, security guarantees. He says any territorial compromises would make us weaker as a state. The war, as we know it, is destroying his country, though, isn't it? Even if Russia were to withdraw from Ukraine, it is still going to be at Ukraine's border. What kind of security guarantees can and should NATO and the United States give Ukraine?
Well, I think we're demonstrating the support Zelensky is getting from NATO and the United States. You have to remember, when I was there in Sakyur, there was a meeting in Paris in 1997 where there was something called the NATO-Ukraine Founding Act, and there was a NATO-Russian Founding Act. Both presidents were there with all the heads of state of NATO. And from that became something called the Partnership for Peace, and we have a program called the State Partnership Program. And so that was the beginning of the linkage of Ukraine to NATO. And so the idea was that they were going to be on the path to membership. And I think we made a mistake in 2014 when the Russians went into Crimea of not making a stronger stand. But that invasion didn't, perpetuated what we're going through now.
You say you made a mistake in 2014, but some would argue that the mistake was made way before 2014 when the United States pushed NATO to move deeper into Eastern European countries, when there was that so-called NATO eastward expansion, which was in breach of the assurances that were made by the US Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, when he told Mikhail Gorbachev in February 1990, according to declassified US, Soviet, French, and British documents, that NATO would never move 1 inch eastwards. Was that a fundamental mistake that was made?
Well, the way I've answered that in the past, in this Partnership for Peace that we have, that these countries are free, democratic countries. And they make their own decisions. And those countries that want to come in and compete for NATO membership go through a process. But that's a decision politically those countries have to make. And someone's going to tell Poland or Bulgaria or Romania that you cannot make your own decisions.
But is the question of Ukraine's NATO membership an academic question at this stage?
Well, I think it's a question that is on other people. In my view, I would have voted for them in 2014 when the Soviets went into Crimea. But we are where we are, and so. But
does it bring more or less stability to the rest of Europe to have countries like Ukraine be part of NATO?
I think it does bring stability.
As a retired 4-star general, someone whose career began in Vietnam, you have said it is extremely important to set what you call the conditions for success. Do you believe that the conditions for success exist today in Ukraine? Is there a well-defined mission? And what is the end game?
Well, let me explain the 4 conditions. One is clarity of mission. The second one is unity of command. The third one is a clarity or rules of engagement. The fourth one is timely political decisions.
Let's take the first one, clarity of mission. Is there clarity in that mission?
I think the clarity is the Ukrainians are being invaded. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. Russia is first, Ukraine is second. And so this large country wants to have democracy, wants to live in peace and freedom. Are we going to deny that? Because Russia says that we want our former Warsaw Pact and countries back in the fold, back under Russian control. I think that's a dangerous position, because you have not only the former Warsaw Pact countries, but Moldova, Georgia, little countries like that will get swallowed up in all of that.
Do you see this as a proxy war between the United States and Russia? Because it appears, for any objective observer here in Washington, that the United States is hell-bent on weakening Russia.
No. I don't see it. I don't see it trying to weaken Russia.
Do you feel that the West and that the United States did enough to deter the fight? Because you once said, if you can deter a fight rather than fight one, deter it. Did the West and NATO do anything to deter the fight? Because one hears in every statement the unprovoked Russian aggression. Whether one agrees with that statement or not, the reality is a bit more nuanced. Would you agree?
If you're painted the picture of the United States as a bad guy here, no, I don't see that.
But I'm hearing you and many other officials here in Washington say that we are going to continue the fight. We're going to keep pouring weapons into Ukraine until Russia is defeated. But you told me earlier that you don't think that necessarily there's going to be one side that wins on the battlefield, is there?
No, I think it's going to be hopefully solved with negotiations, and not just with Russia and the United States, but Russia and Ukraine, and the full force now of NATO.
Will cooler heads prevail, including here in Washington?
I hope so.
All right, General George Jolwen, former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. European Command and NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure, and good luck to you.
Thank you. Meanwhile, as the war in Ukraine enters the next phase with both sides bent on forcing a military outcome, the international economic fallout of the conflict continues to grow. Since February 2022, the U.S. Congress has appropriated over $113 billion of aid and military assistance to Ukraine. The United Kingdom has committed $2.7 billion, and Germany $4.5 billion for 2022-2023. The psychological war on casualty numbers continues. The United Nations has recorded over 7,000 civilian deaths. The actual death toll, however, civilian and military, is estimated between 200,000 to 300,000. To date, and after just 1 year, this war is likely to become the bloodiest of the 21st century. The war has triggered a global food crisis, with the price of staple items such as meat, dairy and grain soaring, with the global food price index increasing by 58.5%. The war has also produced extreme price volatility of raw materials used in agriculture and industrial production, such as aluminum, nickel, palladium and potash used for fertilizers. The economic fallout of the war has been further exacerbated by export restrictions, sanctions and shipping bottlenecks. In 2022, 9 countries had an estimated 12,700 nuclear warheads in their arsenals, with the United States and Russia accounting for over 4,500 warheads each. Around 2,000 US, Russian, British and French warheads are believed to be on high alert. With the US, Ukraine and Russia seeking a military outcome to the war, the risk of a nuclear conflict increases. Joining me now to discuss the continuing global implications of the war are Andrew Danieri, Assistant Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and Philip Carber, president of the Potomac Foundation. He served as strategy advisor to the Secretary of Defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Reagan administration. Philip Carber, you were invited by the Ukrainian government back in 2014 to be an observer to the conflict. Many have argued that this latest war, in fact, began in 2014, not in 2022.
Absolutely.
You briefed NATO allied governments from the front line back then and did a study for the US Army on lessons learned. Were any significant lessons learned in 2014 that were actually implemented in 2022?
So virtually all the lessons that we highlighted from 2014, the importance of anti-tank weapons, the importance of dominance of artillery, the importance of arming Ukraine, all of those have come to fruition as lessons. Unfortunately, we did not follow or implement a lot of them, but those lessons were spot on, and including the dominance of drones.
But how is arming Ukraine a lesson, though? Because a lot of people are suggesting that this will not be won militarily, that no side can defeat the other.
I strongly disagree with that. That assumes that Putin is going to accept a long-term solution to this as a compromise from his objective. Okay, he doesn't even have the territory he's already incorporated into Russia as you know. So this war, you could, if you said, okay, you have a ceasefire on the current position, that's it. He's already signed 2 ceasefires. How many times do we have to sign an agreement and have him break the agreement?
But are you saying that the Ukrainians can actually overwhelm the Russians and defeat them militarily, no matter how much support they're getting from NATO allies? Can they?
No. But
so how does this end?
Can they beat the Russians? Yes, but they need Western support. For example, last summer when I briefed NATO, I said they desperately need more tanks because they've had such high losses. The Poles came through and gave them 220 of their tanks. I later described it. It was like the Polish hussars arriving at the gates of Vienna in 1600 to save the West. But when those tanks arrived, what do you think allowed the Ukrainians to do the counteroffensives that cleared not only the Kherson area, but all the way down through Kharkiv? So arming them is the best deal that we can achieve, and it's the fastest way to end the war.
Is it the fastest way to end the war? Because one has the impression, Andrew Danieri, that many countries in the West, particularly here the United States, seem to have more of a stake in prolonging this war, in weakening Russia, than they do in seeing an early end to this war.
Well, absolutely. I mean, arming Ukraine is the fastest way to end the war. And I think Phil's right that the lessons we have learned from 2014 and onward are that Russia doesn't respect any treaty, any ceasefire, any piece of paper, really. Putin's not a reliable, not a good faith negotiator or narrator of the conflict. And given that, the way to kick Russia out of Ukraine, for Ukraine to win, is for them to win militarily. And that means the West needs to send weapons faster, and they need to be of advanced caliber.
And that's the question. Can the Ukrainians win militarily, and can they win fast enough? Because we heard some startling remarks made by the NATO Secretary General admitting that there have been difficulties in supplying the Ukrainians with artillery shells. Production isn't keeping up with demand. We know that there is frustration among Ukrainians. The German defense minister as well suggested that the tanks that have been promised aren't going to make their way to Ukraine anytime soon. How long can the Ukrainians afford to wait?
Well, part of the answer is in your question there. I think you say that the tanks aren't going to get there fast enough. We need to send them faster if Ukraine is going to win. And to give you another example, the U.S. has so far declined to give ATACMS, essentially HIMARS that can strike 300 kilometers. We've sent 80-kilometer HIMARS. If you send these systems to Ukraine that can strike 300 kilometers, that pushes Russian lines back from territory and will force Russian regular forces back, allowing Ukraine to advance even further and get closer to victory.
May I comment on that? Because Andrew has a really critical point. One of the reasons that we haven't sent longer-range systems, well, we don't want them to hit traditional Russian territory. Well, if the Ukrainians agree to not put the ATACMS east of the Dnieper and below and keep it south of the 20th parallel, guess what? Russian territory isn't within range. And you say, well, what would they keep that promise? They've kept the promise with the HIMARS. And checked with us every time they're going to use it. So that's a shibboleth. That's a bad assumption that Westerns make. One other assumption: no, we are not out of equipment. Okay.
But should it signal something?
The U.S. Army has enough equipment deployed already in Europe for the Ukrainians to have a double victory, okay? All we have to do is give them part of that and then backfill from the National Guard. We have tanks and artillery and equipment in depth.
But we know that the Abrams tanks, all 31 of them, aren't going to be arriving anytime before. Some estimates put it at August. Hold on. And then you need the training that goes with that. Should it signal something? Hold on, let me just ask you.
Sure.
Should it signal something to Zelensky that not only are some countries not pledging enough, that it is going to take quite a bit of time before he gets his hands on the weapons?
We need to put this argument to bed. It's false. Neither the United States nor NATO has any desire to see Ukraine bleed Russia. We want to end the war. One of the lessons we didn't learn was getting ready for this war. So we are unprepared. One of the lessons that the Biden administration learned from Bush's efforts in the war on terror was don't go by yourself, bring the allies with you. And they've done a good job of that. They have done, I could criticize them on certain things, but they've done a good job of bringing the allies. It's just takes some time. Now,
but you say we want to end the war. What is the United States doing
so why do we want to end the war?
push for diplomacy and a negotiated solution?
Why do we want to end the war?
What is the U.S. doing?
Ma'am, I finish the sentence. We want to end the war because every Ukrainian who is keeping the Russians at bay and out of Europe is one less American that has to be on the ground in Europe. Every Ukrainian. So, and they will cease to exist as a military power and as a country if we don't get serious about giving them the ability to win back, to push the Russians out of their territory.
Andrew Danieri, do you agree with this?
I'll put a finer point on this. It's much easier, like Philip says, to defeat Putin in Ukraine than it would be to defeat him on NATO territory. And we in the West can send Ukraine weapons, materiel, cash for assistance without sending any American soldiers to die in Ukraine.
But you are admitting then that this is by proxy, not Ukraine versus Russia, but it's actually NATO, the United States, Ukraine versus Russia.
It's absolutely Ukraine versus Russia. No American soldiers are fighting on the ground in Ukraine. Ukraine has not asked us for soldiers. We are supporting Ukraine to defend its sovereignty, to defend its territory, and to defend European security from malign Kremlin aggression.
But it has all the NATO firepower. So to suggest that this is strictly Ukraine against Russia isn't quite accurate, is it? I mean, how concerned might you be that if there isn't a peaceful solution sometime soon, that this conflict could actually spiral out of control? And that it could affect other countries in the region?
It's a risk, but it's a small risk. I think Putin lays out these fake red lines every so often. Oh, I'm going to use nukes. Oh, this is a red line. And he's backed down every single time.
But there could be a miscalculation. There could be an accident.
So let's address that. Putin has been escalating. This is already escalated. This invasion, the war started in 2014. This invasion is a massive escalation. It's the largest military use of force by a major power, not only in Europe, since the end of the Second World War.
But this isn't really about right and wrong, is it? It is about realpolitik at the end of the day, isn't it? Because President Zelensky says that he is not willing to make any territorial concessions. But does he truly believe that Russia will say goodbye to Crimea, goodbye to the Donbass? Will he have to make some compromises territorially at the end of the day?
So if you play that game, there is no end to it. They take a bite here, they take a bite there, and they just keep biting. And so the only way to stop that is not have a temporary break in the fighting and then get bitten again. And you are going to get bitten again, not only in Poland, not only in Ukraine, but in the other countries he desires. They will come. So, and he said they will, including the Baltics. Already the Russians are trying to put pressure on the Baltics. In Poland. It's very important to give the Ukrainians the ability to push him out. And with the defeat of his field army, he then doesn't have that option. If he wants to fire a nuclear weapon, go ahead, because it is not going to help. It's not going to bring him that territory. All he's going to do is destroy it.
All right, Andrew Danieri, Philip Carber, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
For the West and NATO, Russia's aggression in February 2022 was unprovoked. For Russia and others, not so. Whatever the truth is, if there is ever such a thing in geopolitical rivalries, unprovoked or provoked, the ongoing war is destroying Ukraine. And as is the case with any other war, the longer it is allowed, even encouraged, to continue, the more innocent lives, civilian and military, will perish. And the longer it goes on, the higher the risk of a spillover and of an unthinkable nuclear war. Like many wars before it, this conflict, which should have been averted, can only be stopped when all sides agree to sit around the negotiating table to stop the bloodshed and the destruction of Ukraine. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching. See you next time.